Night shift at the forgotten moat. Jacob's hand trembled as he turned the key in the lock of the small, forgotten motel nestled on the outskirts of town. It was his first night as the new caretaker, filling in after the previous night manager abruptly quit. He had heard stories about this place, rumors whispered among the locals, the kind you laugh off, but secretly hope aren't true. The motel, though small, felt vast in the stillness of the night. Its corridors were dimly lit, the peeling wallpaper barely visible in the flickering light. Outside, the wind howled, and the empty parking lot stretched into the distance, swallowed by the fog that rolled in like a living thing. As he sat behind the front desk, Jacob glanced at the guest register. Only 3 rooms were occupied, but something felt wrong. Room 13 was listed as vacant, yet a faint light glowed from under its door down the hall. He frowned, reaching for the old-fashioned phone to call maintenance, only to remember the landline had been cut off long ago. He decided to investigate. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally long as he approached room 13. His footsteps echoed louder than they should have, and the air felt thick, as if the motel itself were holding its breath. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his knuckles poised to knock. But before he could, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was dark, save for the pale light of a TV casting eerie shadows. The static crackled, and an odd chill settled over Jacob. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The bed was neatly made, but there was a sense that someone or something was there. A low whisper floated through the air, the words too faint to understand, but chilling all the same. "Hello?" Jacob called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The TV flickered, and for a brief moment an image appeared on the screen. A figure standing in the room, its face obscured by shadows. Jacob's heart raced. He turned to look behind him, but the room was empty. The door, however, was now closed. Fear gnawed at him as he fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unnatural hum. Panic surged through him, and he pounded on the door. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. A deep, guttural voice spoke from behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." Jacob froze, dread washing over him. Slowly he turned, but the room was empty. Yet, in the TV's reflection, he saw it. Something dark, something ancient, lurking just behind him. Its eyes gleamed with malice, its form shifting and writhing in the shadows. The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. Jacob's breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away from the reflection, desperate to escape. But the figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. With a final surge of terror, Jacob lunged for the door. This time, it flew open, and he stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The corridor was deathly silent now, the flickering lights steady once more. Behind him, room 13 was dark again, the door closed as if nothing had happened. Shaken, Jacob returned to the front desk, heart pounding in his chest. The guest register caught his eye again, and his blood ran cold. Room 13 was now listed as occupied. By him. As he stood frozen in place, the TV behind the desk flickered on. Static filled the screen before fading to reveal a new guest in room 13. A man with terrified eyes, pounding on the door, begging for help. Jacob's reflection stared back at him, trapped in the grainy footage of the motel's haunted past. Jacob stood paralyzed, staring at the screen, his breath shallow as he watched the figure in the TV pounding on the door. He knew it was him, but how? His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. The air around him felt thick, pressing in from all sides, and the faint whisper from room 13 echoed in his ears. The phone at the desk suddenly rang, cutting through the silence. Jacob jumped, staring at it in disbelief. The phone lines were dead. He knew that. But the old rotary phone rattled on the counter, demanding to be answered. His hand hovered over the receiver before he picked it up, his palm slick with sweat. "Hello?" he whispered, voice trembling. There was a long pause, then a low, distorted voice on the other end. "You can't leave." Jacob's stomach churned as the voice crackled through the phone. He slammed the receiver down and backed away, his legs shaking. His instincts screamed to run, but something in the motel held him in place, like a spider's web, drawing its prey deeper into the trap. The lights above him flickered, dimming as the sound of faint footsteps echoed down the hall. Footsteps that didn't belong to any of the guests. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he peered down the long corridor. At the far end, a figure stood in the shadows, barely visible, watching. He blinked, and the figure vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence. "Leave now," a voice whispered from behind him. Jacob spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway remained empty, but he could feel something watching him, waiting. Panic surged through him, and he bolted for the exit. His feet pounded against the carpet as he rushed through the lobby, throwing the front doors open. But the world outside was wrong. The fog had thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, and beyond it, the highway had disappeared. The parking lot stretched into an endless void, a vast expanse of nothingness. He could no longer tell where the motel ended and the fog began. Jacob took a step back, his chest tightening. He turned, desperate to find an escape, but the front doors had slammed shut behind him, locking him inside. The motel's oppressive presence seemed to grow stronger, wrapping around him like a vice. He stumbled backward, tripping over the worn rug, and fell to the floor. The faint whispers returned, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of disembodied voices. "You belong here now." The words echoed in his mind, and Jacob crawled backward, his eyes darting around the room. Suddenly, the lights above him flickered once more, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The air grew colder, and the whispers took on a malevolent tone, filling every corner of the lobby. Just as he scrambled to his feet, the lobby TV flickered back to life. The image of room 13 appeared on the screen again, but this time the door slowly creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was Jacob, his face twisted in terror, his eyes hollow, lost to the void. And then he heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from behind. Jacob turned to see the shadowed figure from earlier, standing at the end of the hallway, its form more defined now, tall and grotesque, with limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It took a step toward him, and Jacob's body froze with paralyzing fear. The whispers in his mind screamed louder. "Join us, forever." Jacob's throat tightened as the shadowy figure at the end of the hallway began to move. Its elongated limbs scraped the walls, and the air seemed to ripple around it. Each step it took echoed in Jacob's skull, like the ticking of a clock counting down his last moments. He backed away, heart hammering, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. His eyes darted around the lobby, looking for any exit, but the oppressive fog outside still swirled, erasing the world beyond the motel's walls. The whispers in his head grew louder, a chorus of voices pulling him closer to the creature. "Join us. Stay forever." Jacob shook his head violently, trying to shake the voices away, but they only became more insistent, rising into a maddening hum. The figure was now halfway down the hall, its grotesque form more visible. Its skin was stretched and pale, its eyes, if it had any, hidden beneath a thick veil of darkness that cloaked its face. In a panic, Jacob darted behind the front desk, searching for anything. Keys, a weapon, something that could give him a chance. His fingers brushed against a drawer, and he yanked it open. Inside was an old rusted key marked Manager's Office. Without thinking, he grabbed it and bolted down a side hallway, the creature's footsteps quickening behind him. The manager's office was at the far end of the hall. Jacob fumbled with the key, his hands shaking as the whispers became a roar in his ears. Just as the footsteps reached the corner behind him, he managed to unlock the door and slam it shut behind him. He leaned against the door, his chest heaving, trying to catch his breath. The pounding footsteps stopped outside. Silence. But the voices didn't fade. They continued to claw at his mind, digging deeper, each whisper more desperate, more demanding. The office was small, cluttered with old paperwork and dusty furniture. A single window looked out into the fog, but there was no escape that way. Jacob's gaze landed on a row of monitors on the desk, security cameras, all trained on different parts of the motel. He stared at the flickering images, his heart skipping a beat. Every room appeared empty, but something was wrong. The camera feed for room 13 was static again, with flashes of that same shadowy figure, its form lingering near the bed. But as Jacob watched, the static cleared just long enough for him to see it. His own reflection, trapped in room 13, banging on the door, his face twisted in terror. It wasn't possible. He was here, in the office. But the screen showed him, another version of him, desperately trying to escape room 13. The lights in the office flickered, and a deep guttural voice filled the room, louder now, closer. "You cannot run. You cannot hide." Suddenly, the office door rattled violently, as if something was trying to break in. Jacob backed away, heart thudding in his chest. The whispers swirled into a cacophony of madness, blending with the voice that boomed from every corner of the room. The door shuddered again, and then silence. Jacob stood frozen, his eyes locked on the door, waiting, his pulse racing. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew he was trapped. Then the monitors flickered again, and this time they all showed the same thing. Room 13. The door slowly opened, revealing the same shadowy figure from before. The image cut to Jacob's terrified reflection once more, still trapped, still banging. But now, his reflection looked directly at the camera and smiled. A chill crawled down Jacob's spine as the reflection's grin widened, stretching unnaturally across his face. The lights above him flickered one last time, and the whispers reached their peak, filling his mind with a single, deafening command. "It's time." Suddenly, the door to the office creaked open. But this time, it wasn't the shadowy figure on the other side. It was him, the same twisted version of himself from room 13, now standing in the doorway, eyes hollow and grin wide. Jacob backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The other him stepped forward, the grin never fading. "You took my place," the reflection whispered, its voice a perfect echo of his own. "Now it's your turn." Jacob felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, and everything went dark. Jacob's world plunged into darkness, the cold grip on his shoulder tightening, as if pulling him into the abyss. He gasped, struggling to breathe as the voices around him grew louder, merging into one overpowering force. His mind spun as he tried to fight against the sensation of being swallowed by something unseen, something vast and eternal. Suddenly, the darkness lifted, and Jacob found himself standing in the hallway outside room 13. His heart raced as he looked around in confusion. The air was thick with tension, the familiar static hum echoing in his ears. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat, when he saw the door to room 13 ajar. The light from inside flickered weakly, casting long shadows into the hallway. His hands trembled, and a deep sense of dread washed over him as he realized where he was. His reflection, the one that had haunted him on the monitor, had brought him back to room 13. A faint metallic scraping sound drew his attention to the floor. The rusted key to the room lay at his feet. He bent down and picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver through his body. His mind screamed to run, to leave the motel and never look back. But his legs moved on their own, driven by some unseen force. He stepped closer to the open door, the whispers once again filling his ears. "Welcome home." Jacob pushed the door open wider, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the flickering TV, casting a ghostly glow over the bed. The air was heavy, and the smell of dampness and decay filled his nostrils. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe on the walls, as if alive. And then, on the bed, he saw it. A figure lay motionless, its body twisted unnaturally, the sheets tangled around its limbs. Jacob's heart nearly stopped when he realized who it was. Himself. His own lifeless body, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, His knees buckled and he stumbled back, hitting the doorframe. The room seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with its malevolent energy. He turned, desperate to escape, but the door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, trapping him inside. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic symphony of madness, as the figure on the bed slowly turned its head to look at him. Its hollow eyes locked onto Jacob, and a twisted smile spread across its face. "You took my place," it whispered, the voice a chilling echo of his own. Jacob backed against the wall, his mind reeling. The figure on the bed rose, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. It stood at the foot of the bed, watching him with that same hollow grin. "You can't escape," the reflection whispered. "You belong to the motel now." Suddenly, the walls of the room began to shift, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal dark, pulsating shadows beneath. The room was alive, feeding off the terror that gripped Jacob's soul. The air crackled with electricity, and the floor beneath his feet began to tremble. The reflection stepped forward, its grin growing wider, more grotesque. "It's your turn now, just like all the others before you." Jacob's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. The stories about the motel weren't just rumors. It was a trap, an endless loop of souls, each caretaker doomed to take the place of the one before. "No," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "I won't. I can't." But the reflection's eyes burned with malice. "You have no choice." The room began to spin, the shadows closing in around him. The reflection reached out, its hand cold and lifeless as it touched Jacob's chest. His body stiffened, and he felt an overwhelming force pulling him downward, as if the floor beneath him had become a black hole, dragging him into its depths. The last thing Jacob saw before the darkness swallowed him was the reflection's hollow, lifeless eyes. His own eyes, staring back at him with a twisted satisfaction. Jacob awoke in room 13, lying on the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. His body felt heavy, his limbs numb. Slowly he sat up, looking around the room with a sense of eerie familiarity. He was the new caretaker now. The whispers were gone, replaced by the hum of the TV. The door to the room stood open, inviting him to leave. But he knew better. He had seen what waited outside, the endless fog, the emptiness. There was no escape. With a resigned sigh, Jacob stood and walked to the door. He stepped out into the hallway, feeling the motel's presence wrap around him like a cold embrace. The static from the TV faded as he approached the front desk, and the guest register sat waiting for him. Room 13 was vacant again. Jacob picked up the pen, his hand moving on its own as he wrote a single name in the register. Jacob Morris, Room 13, permanent. The pen dropped from his hand, clattering onto the desk. He stared at the name, knowing that soon someone else would take his place. The next caretaker would come, just like he had, unaware of the motel's true nature.